Miss Marple and the Corpse. In the Garden, Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the pristine lawn of Willowmere House, where the annual summer garden party proceeded with the measured grace that St. Mary Mead expected of such occasions. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a wicker chair beneath the spreading oak tree, appeared to be doing nothing more strenuous than observing the hydrangeas while sipping her tea. In truth, she was cataloguing human nature with the precision of a botanist examining specimens. "More cucumber sandwiches, Miss Marple?" asked Dolly Bantry, hostess of the event and mistress of Willowmere House. Her voice carried that particular brightness that suggested she was determined everyone should enjoy themselves, whether they wished to or not. How kind, Mrs. Bantry. Just one, I think. Miss Marple accepted the delicate triangle of bread with a gentle smile. What a lovely gathering, and such a splendid turnout. Indeed, it seemed half the village had assembled on the Bantry's lawn. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was holding court near the rose arbour, her hat adorned with an unfortunate arrangement of artificial cherries. Young Dr. Haydock moved through the crowd with professional bonhomie, stopping to inquire after various ailments both real and imagined. The local solicitor, Mr. Raymond West, no relation to Miss Marple's nephew of the same surname, stood somewhat apart, his pinched face suggesting he found the entire affair frivolous. "I do think garden parties are such civilized affairs," continued Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple. "Nothing ever really goes wrong at a garden party, does it?" Miss Marple's needles paused in their steady clicking. In her experience, that was precisely when things did go wrong, when everyone assumed they wouldn't. But she merely smiled and said, "Indeed, dear, most civilized." The object of much covert attention that afternoon was Mrs. Sylvia Thornton, recently arrived from London to occupy the old Ashford cottage. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 45, well dressed in a way that made the village ladies feel simultaneously provincial and suspicious. She stood near the tennis court in animated conversation with Colonel Arthur Bantry, Dolly's husband, whose red face suggested either the warmth of the day or an excess of attention from an attractive woman. "That woman," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, the village's self-appointed moral guardian, as she passed Miss Marple's chair. "Wearing trousers to a garden party. Trousers! And the way she's monopolizing poor Arthur." Miss Marple said nothing, but her keen eyes noted that Mrs. Thornton's conversation partner seemed far from reluctant. She also noted the rigid set of Dolly Bantry's shoulders as she observed her husband from across the lawn. The party drifted through its prescribed stages. The admiration of the herbaceous borders, the polite consumption of strawberries and cream, the gentle mockery of the vicar's attempts at croquet. It was during the latter activity, when most of the guests had migrated toward the croquet lawn, that Miss Marple noticed something odd. Gregory Ashford, the nephew of the cottage's previous owner, had arrived late to the party. A thin young man of about 30 with nervous hands and an anxious demeanour. He'd been hovering near the refreshment table, apparently building up courage to approach Mrs. Thornton. Miss Marple had watched this performance with interest, recognizing the signs of someone with something urgent to say and no idea how to say it. But now Gregory had disappeared entirely. And when Miss Marple's gaze swept the garden with practised thoroughness, she noticed that Mrs. Thornton, too, was no longer visible. "Has anyone seen Sylvia?" Colonel Bantry's voice carried across the lawn, tinged with concern that he tried to mask as casual inquiry. A general murmuring suggested that no one had. The vicar suggested she might have stepped inside to powder her nose. Mrs. Price Ridley suggested, with a sniff, that she'd probably left without saying goodbye, as that type was wont to do. Miss Marple set down her teacup and rose with deliberate calm. Perhaps someone should check the lower garden, she suggested mildly. I noticed Mrs. Thornton admiring the dahlias earlier. She may have wandered down to see them more closely. Dr. Haydock, ever practical, volunteered to investigate. I'll just take a quick look. No sense causing alarm over nothing. But it was not nothing. The doctor's shout brought the garden party to an immediate halt. Those on the croquet lawn froze, mallets suspended. Mrs. Bantry dropped her teacup, which shattered musically on the flagstones. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, for once, was rendered speechless, and someone fetched the police. Dr. Haydock's voice carried an edge Miss Marple had never heard before. And everyone else, stay where you are. The doctor emerged from behind the dahlia beds, his face pale beneath its professional tan. He walked directly to Colonel Bantry, speaking in a low voice. But in the shocked silence of the garden, his words carried clearly. It's Mrs. Thornton, Colonel. I'm afraid she's dead. Strangled by the look of it. The civilized garden party dissolved into chaos. Mrs. Clement fainted directly into the vicar's arms. Mrs. Price Ridley began exclaiming that she'd known something terrible would happen. She'd felt it all morning. Young ladies screamed. Gentlemen rushed forward, then stopped, uncertain of what to do. Through it all, Miss Marple remained seated beneath her oak tree, her knitting needles moving with steady rhythm. But her blue eyes were sharp and watchful, taking note of everything. Who had gone pale, who had looked merely startled, who had not looked surprised at all. And she was particularly interested in the fact that Gregory Ashford, who had been so anxious to speak with Mrs. Thornton earlier, was nowhere to be seen. The afternoon sun continued to cast its dappled shadows across the lawn of Willowmere House, but the innocence of the summer afternoon had been shattered as completely as Mrs. Bantry's teacup. Murder, that most uncivilized of acts, had invaded the garden party. And Miss Marple, that deceptively gentle lady with her knitting and her mild observations, had already begun to notice things that others had missed. Chapter 2. The village stirs. Inspector Slack of the local constabulary arrived with his customary air of harried importance, accompanied by Sergeant Lake, a younger man who had learned to temper his superior's impetuosity with quiet efficiency. The inspector was a stout man with a bristling moustache and a tendency to reach conclusions before examining evidence, a fault that had, on previous occasions, led him directly into Miss Marple's gentle corrections. Right then, Inspector Slack announced to the assembled guests, who had been corralled onto the upper lawn while constables secured the scene. Nobody leaves. I'll want statements from each and every one of you. The body had been discovered in a small clearing behind the dahlia beds, partially concealed by the ornamental shrubbery that Mrs. Bantry had planted with such care. Mrs. Thornton lay on her back, her silk scarf, an expensive Parisian affair in peacock blue, twisted tightly around her neck. Her eyes stared unseeing at the sky, and her carefully arranged hair had come loose from its pins. Dr. Haydock pressed into service as medical examiner until the official one could arrive from Much Benham. Estimated she'd been dead no more than 30 minutes, which meant as Inspector Slack was quick to point out that the murderer was almost certainly still at the garden party. Bound to be that nephew fellow, the inspector declared with satisfaction. Always the family when there's money involved. Where is this Gregory Ashford? But Gregory Ashford could not be found. His absence seemed to confirm the inspector's theory, and constables were dispatched to search the grounds and the surrounding village. Miss Marple had allowed herself to be shepherded into the drawing-room along with the other guests, where tea was being served with trembling hands by Mrs. Bantry's parlour-maid, Annie. The girl was on the verge of hysterics, and small wonder, murder was not part of her usual duties. "I always said that woman was trouble," Mrs. Price Ridley announced to anyone within earshot, which was everyone. Coming here from London with her sophisticated airs, one could tell she had a past. "Oh, surely that's rather harsh," ventured Mrs. Clement, who had recovered from her faint but retained a grey pallor. "The poor woman is dead." "Murdered," corrected Mrs. Price Ridley with grim satisfaction. "There's a difference. Murder suggests one has made enemies. I heard, though of course I would never spread gossip, that she'd been involved in some sort of scandal in London, something to do with another woman's husband." Miss Marple, seated in a corner chair with her knitting, appeared absorbed in a particularly complex stitch, but her ears, as sharp as her eyes, missed nothing. "Did you know Mrs. Thornton well, Colonel?" asked Mr. Raymond West, the solicitor, with more directness than was quite polite. Colonel Bantry, slumped in an armchair with a whisky that his wife had wordlessly provided, looked up with haunted eyes. "Hardly at all. Met her when she took the cottage, naturally. Neighbourly courtesy and all that. But, well, no, can't say I did." This was not precisely true, as several people in the room could have attested. The Colonel had been seen calling at Ashford Cottage on multiple occasions, and on at least one evening his car had been parked outside until nearly midnight. But no one spoke these observations aloud, not yet. The English countryside ran on unspoken understandings, and direct accusation was considered poor form. "What about this nephew?" pressed the solicitor. "Gregory Ashford. He inherited the cottage from his uncle, didn't he? And then almost immediately leased it to Mrs. Thornton. Seemed odd at the time." "Not odd at all," said Mrs. Bantry, with surprising sharpness. "The boy needed the income. Everyone knows he's been in financial difficulties since his uncle's death. Death duties and all that." "Financial difficulties," repeated Mrs. Price Ridley meaningfully. "And now his tenant is dead. One wonders about the terms of their lease. Life insurance, perhaps? Or had she threatened to break the lease?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She appeared to be counting stitches, her lips moving silently. But she was actually reconstructing the afternoon in her mind. Mrs. Thornton arriving at 2:30, fashionably late in that smart motor car of hers. Gregory Ashford appearing even later, at nearly 3:30, looking agitated and searching the crowd immediately upon arrival. The two of them disappearing separately. Mrs. Thornton first, about 15 minutes before Gregory vanished. And then the grim discovery. But there was something else. Something that niggled at the corner of her mind like a dropped stitch that needed picking up. "Something about the scarf, Miss Marple." Mrs. Bantry's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you quite all right? You look rather pale." "Just a bit tired, dear. Such excitement is trying at my age." Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile, though I must say I did notice something rather peculiar earlier. Inspector Slack, who had entered the drawing-room to begin his interviews, overheard this last remark and approached with visible reluctance. Experience had taught him that Miss Marple's peculiar observations had an annoying tendency to be correct. "And And what might that be, Miss Marple? Well, it may be nothing at all, Inspector. Probably just my foolish fancy. But I couldn't help noticing that Mrs. Thornton wasn't wearing that blue scarf when she arrived at the party. There was a moment of silence as this statement was absorbed. Not wearing it? The inspector frowned. But it must have been under her jacket, or... No, Inspector. I observed Mrs. Thornton quite carefully when she arrived, as one does. She was wearing a pale yellow blouse with her trouser suit, and her neck was quite bare, except for a single strand of pearls. The scarf, that particular peacock blue scarf, was definitely not visible. Perhaps it was in her handbag, suggested Dr. Haydock reasonably. Perhaps, agreed Miss Marple. Though it does make one wonder, doesn't it, where the scarf came from, I mean, if not from her person. Inspector Slack's face took on a mulish expression that suggested he was filing this information away as irrelevant. What I want to know is where this Gregory Ashford has got to. Young man disappears just when a murder's committed. That tells its own story, does it? Murmured Miss Marple, apparently addressing her knitting. Yes, I suppose it might. But her tone suggested she thought it told quite a different story than the one Inspector Slack had in mind. Chapter 3. Secrets and Lies. By evening, Gregory Ashford still had not been found, and Inspector Slack's conviction of his guilt had hardened into certainty. The constables reported that the young man's own cottage, a small dwelling on the edge of the village, appeared hastily abandoned. Clothes were strewn about, and a suitcase lay open on the bed, half-packed. Flight, declared the inspector with satisfaction. Clear evidence of guilt. He'll have taken the afternoon train to London, mark my words. We'll have him by morning. Miss Marple had accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to stay for a cold supper, the garden party's elaborate menu being redistributed in more sombre circumstances. The remaining guests had finally been allowed to depart after giving their statements, though Inspector Slack had made it clear that no one was to leave the village without permission. I simply cannot believe it of Gregory, Mrs. Bantry said, pushing food around her plate without eating. He's such a gentle boy, and why on earth would he kill his tenant? The lease arrangement was working perfectly well for both of them. Colonel Bantry, who had been uncharacteristically silent during supper, suddenly spoke. There's something I should tell you, Dolly, and the inspector, I suppose. He took a long swallow of wine. Sylvia, Mrs. Thornton, came to see me 3 days ago, here in my study. She was in a state about Gregory. Mrs. Bantry set down her fork with deliberate care. What sort of state? She said he'd been harassing her, calling at the cottage at odd hours, leaving notes, making strange accusations. She said he claimed she'd stolen something of his, something his uncle had hidden in the cottage before he died. She insisted she knew nothing about it, but Gregory was becoming increasingly erratic. She asked if I, as a justice of the peace, could intervene. And did you? Miss Marple asked gently. The colonel's face reddened. I went to speak with Gregory the next day. He wasn't himself, rambling on about family heirlooms and honour and his uncle's dying wishes. Said Mrs. Thornton had found something valuable and was refusing to return it. When I pressed him on what this object was, he became evasive. Said it was a personal matter, nothing criminal, but that justice needed to be done. Did you believe him? Colonel Bantry hesitated. I believed he believed it, whether there was any truth to it. He shrugged helplessly. The boy was desperate, that much was clear. His uncle's death left him in dire straits financially, and I think the strain had affected his mind. Mrs. Bantry reached across the table to touch her husband's hand. Arthur, you must tell Inspector Slack all of this. I know, my dear, I know. He looked suddenly older. the events of the day having etched new lines into his face. Poor Sylvia. Whatever else she may have been, she didn't deserve that. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing, "whatever else she may have been," and filed it away with her other observations. She had noticed, as had everyone with eyes, the particular warmth between Colonel Bantry and Mrs. Thornton. Whether it had gone beyond flirtation into genuine impropriety was unclear, but in a village the size of St. Mary Mead, even flirtation was enough to fuel months of speculation. After supper, Miss Marple excused herself for a turn in the garden. The police had finished with the immediate crime scene and departed, leaving only a single constable on duty to ensure the area remained undisturbed. The summer evening was soft and fragrant, and fireflies danced above the lawn like scattered stars. Miss Marple did not walk toward the dahlia beds where the body had been found. Instead, she moved slowly along the gravel path that circled the house, her keen eyes taking in the details of the garden in the fading light. She paused at the corner where the path intersected with a narrow track leading to the greenhouses and potting sheds, the servants' domain. There, caught on a rosethorn, was a small fragment of dark cloth. Miss Marple extracted it carefully, holding it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. It was heavy wool, the sort used for men's suits, and it was freshly torn. The edges were still sharp, not frayed by weather or time. She wrapped it carefully in her handkerchief and continued her walk. When she returned to the drawing-room, she found Colonel Bantry alone, staring into a glass of whisky with the air of a man confronting unpleasant truths. "Colonel," Miss Marple said gently, seating herself across from him, "I wonder if I might ask you something rather personal." He looked up, and perhaps because of the whisky, or perhaps because Miss Marple's manner invited confidence, he nodded. "Ask away, Miss Marple. This has been a day for unpleasant revelations. One more hardly matters. Were you in love with Mrs. Thornton?" He winced but did not look away. "I thought I might be. She was different. After 20 years of marriage, the same conversations, the same routines. Sylvia was exciting. She'd lived, really lived, not just existed in a village backwater." He rubbed his face tiredly. "But I never acted on it. I want you to know that. I may have been a fool, but I wasn't a scoundrel." "I believe you," Miss Marple said simply. "But someone might have thought otherwise. Someone might have thought Mrs. Thornton represented a threat to a marriage, or to a family's position in society." The Colonel's eyes widened. "Dolly, good God, no. Dolly wouldn't. She's incapable of violence, perhaps, though one never really knows what someone is capable of until circumstances put them to the test." Miss Marple let that observation settle before continuing. "But I was actually thinking of someone else, someone who might have observed your friendship with Mrs. Thornton and drawn certain conclusions about it." "Who?" "Gregory Ashford." The Colonel frowned. "What would Gregory care about my friendship with his tenant?" "That depends, doesn't it, on what Gregory thought your friendship entitled you to, or what Mrs. Thornton might have told him about it. You said he was making accusations about something she'd stolen from the cottage. But what if that wasn't quite the truth? What if Mrs. Thornton had something, information perhaps, or documents, that Gregory desperately wanted, and she told him she'd given it to you for safekeeping?" Colonel Bantry set down his glass with a sharp click. "But she didn't give me anything. She never mentioned any documents or—" "I know," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But Gregory might not have known that. If Mrs. Thornton told him she'd entrusted something important to you, he might have believed you, and she were in collusion against him. The mind can play strange tricks when one is under strain. You think Gregory killed her in some sort of confused attempt to— what? Retrieve this mysterious object. I think said Miss Marple carefully, "that everyone is assuming Gregory killed Mrs. Thornton. But there's something that troubles me about that assumption." "What?" "The scarf, Colonel. That peacock blue scarf. Mrs. Thornton wasn't wearing it when she arrived at the party. So where did it come from? Who brought it to the garden? And why use it as the murder weapon when there are any number of other methods available?" The Colonel had no answer to that, and Miss Marple didn't expect one. She was thinking aloud, really, the way she did when working through a particularly complex knitting pattern. "And then there's the matter of the timing," she continued. "Mrs. Thornton disappeared from the party at approximately 4 o'clock. Gregory disappeared perhaps 5 minutes later, but Dr. Haydock said she'd been dead no more than 30 minutes when he found her at 4:30, which means she was killed quite quickly after she left the lawn. I don't follow." "Well, it suggests premeditation, doesn't it? Someone knew she would go to that part of the garden, and someone was waiting for her there. But how could Gregory have known? He arrived late to the party and had no opportunity to make arrangements with her. Unless—" She paused, her needles clicking thoughtfully. "Unless she was meeting someone else entirely, and Gregory followed her there." "But then who?" Miss Marple held up a gentle hand. "I find it's best not to theorize too far ahead of one's data, Colonel. I may be quite wrong about all of this, but I do think it would be wise to ask yourself who else might have had reason to want Mrs. Thornton dead, and who else might have access to that particular scarf." She rose to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, Colonel. That object Gregory believed Mrs. Thornton had stolen. Did he give you any idea at all what it might have been?" The Colonel thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "He mentioned something about his uncle's will, said there had been a codicil, a last-minute change that his uncle had made shortly before death. The original solicitor, old Mr. Petherick, had died himself last year, and Gregory couldn't find any record of this codicil among his uncle's papers. He thought Mrs. Thornton might have found it in the cottage and destroyed it because it would have invalidated her lease or some such nonsense." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "Thank you, Colonel. You've been most helpful." As she made her way to the guest room Mrs. Bantry had prepared for her, Miss Marple's mind was working with the precision of a well-oiled machine. A missing codicil, a stolen object, a scarf that appeared from nowhere, and a young man who had fled the scene, leaving behind all appearances of guilt. It was rather like one of her nephew Raymond's detective novels, she thought, full of red herrings and false trails. But unlike a novel, this mystery had claimed a real life, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a killer was sleeping peacefully, confident that Gregory Ashford would take the blame. Miss Marple did not intend to allow that to happen. Chapter 4. The investigation deepens. The next morning brought fresh developments and deeper mysteries. Gregory Ashford had not been found at any of the London railway stations, nor had he taken a bus from the village. It was as if the young man had vanished into thin air, or, as Inspector Slack grimly suggested, had met with foul play himself. "Stands to reason," the inspector told Miss Marple when she encountered him in the village high street. She'd been ostensibly shopping for wool at Miss Hartwell's haberdashery, but in reality she was gathering information with the efficiency of a bee collecting pollen. Young man commits murder in heat of passion, realizes what he's done, perhaps does away with himself, will likely find a body in a ditch somewhere. "How very tragic if that's the case," Miss Marple said mildly. "Though I wonder, Inspector, if you've had a chance to investigate Mrs. Thornton's background more thoroughly. In my experience, murder victims are often the key to their own murders, if you take my meaning." Inspector Slack bristled slightly. He didn't appreciate being told his business by elderly village ladies, no matter how often their observations proved correct. We've been in touch with the London police, naturally. Mrs. Thornton was a widow. Her husband died 5 years ago, left her comfortably situated. No criminal record, no obvious enemies. She moved in respectable circles, belonged to various clubs and societies. Perfectly ordinary, except, Miss Marple pointed out gently, that someone strangled her at a garden party in St. Mary Mead. That's hardly ordinary, Inspector. Before Slack could reply, they were interrupted by the arrival of a well-dressed gentleman in a London motor car. He parked near the greengrocer's and approached the inspector with the air of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Inspector Slack, I'm James Thornton, Sylvia Thornton's brother-in-law. I drove down as soon as I heard the dreadful news. I want to know what you're doing to catch the men who killed her." Miss Marple quietly stepped back, but not so far that she couldn't observe and listen. Mr. James Thornton was perhaps 50, with the bearing of a successful businessman, and the slightly florid complexion that suggested he enjoyed his meals and his port. His grief appeared genuine, though tempered by anger. "We're pursuing all leads, Mr. Thornton," the inspector assured him. "The main suspect is currently missing, but we expect to locate him shortly." "This nephew person? Gregory Ashford?" Thornton's lip curled. "Yes, Sylvia mentioned him in her letters. Said he was becoming a nuisance, making wild accusations. I advised her to break the lease and return to London, but she was stubborn. Liked the quiet of village life, she said." His voice cracked slightly. Damned foolishness. What sort of accusations was Mr. Ashford making? Miss Marple interjected gently, drawing both men's attention. Thornton turned to her, clearly surprised to find himself addressing an elderly lady with a shopping basket. "And you are?" "Miss Jane Marple. I live in the village. I was at the garden party where the tragedy occurred." "I see." Thornton's manner softened slightly. The accusations were nonsense, according to Sylvia. Something about a missing document. She said the boy was obsessed with the idea that his uncle had changed his will at the last moment. Pure fantasy, in my opinion. Old man Ashford's will was perfectly clear and properly executed. The nephew inherited everything, including that cottage. If he'd wanted to live there himself instead of leasing it, he was free to do so. "Did Mrs. Thornton mention finding anything unusual in the cottage?" Miss Marple asked. "Any papers or documents that might have belonged to the late Mr. Ashford?" "She mentioned finding some old letters and photographs when she moved in. She boxed them up and offered to give them to the nephew, but he never came to collect them. Said they were worthless sentimentality." Thornton paused, frowning. "Though now that I think on it, she did mention something else a few weeks ago. Said she'd found a curious hiding place behind a loose stone in the fireplace. There was an old envelope inside, but whatever had been in it was gone. Just an empty envelope with some writing on it." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "What sort of writing?" "She didn't say. Didn't seem important at the time." Thornton's face darkened. "If I'd known it would lead to this—" "You couldn't have known," Miss Marple said kindly. "No one could. But I wonder, Mr. Thornton, if there's anything else about your sister-in-law's recent life that seemed unusual. Any new acquaintances, any changes in her routine or behaviour?" Thornton considered this. "Well, she seemed happier than she'd been since Frederick, that's my brother, died, more engaged with life. She'd joined some sort of historical society, was researching local history, and she mentioned making friends with someone in the village, though she was coy about who. I got the impression it might be a gentleman." He glanced at Inspector Slack. "You might want to look into that, Inspector. Jealousy is a powerful motive." The inspector, who had been thinking precisely the same thing, nodded gravely. We're exploring all avenues, Mr. Thornton." After the two men departed, Thornton to the local inn where he'd taken a room, and the inspector to continue his inquiries, Miss Marple completed her shopping and made her way to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement had invited her for morning coffee, and Miss Marple suspected the vicar's wife was bursting with information that needed sharing. She was not disappointed. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement began the moment they were settled in the drawing room with coffee and seed cake. "The most extraordinary thing. You know how the vicar insists on visiting everyone in the parish, even new arrivals? Well, he called on Mrs. Thornton just last week, and she showed him that historical research she'd been doing. She'd become quite obsessed with the Ashford family history. Said she was writing a paper about the house's previous occupants for the Historical Society's quarterly journal." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she say what she discovered? Something about the original Ashford who built the cottage in the 1840s. Apparently, he was a rather mysterious figure, made his fortune in India, and returned to England under somewhat clouded circumstances. There were rumours he'd acquired his wealth through less than honourable means. Mrs. Thornton was quite excited about it. Said she'd found documentary evidence in the county archives." "Documentary evidence of what exactly?" Mrs. Clement leaned forward conspiratorially. "That's just it. She wouldn't say. She told the vicar she wanted to verify a few more facts before going public. But she believed the Ashford fortune was built on something quite scandalous. She even hinted that the present Gregory Ashford might have reason to want her research suppressed." Miss Marple sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "That does cast things in rather a different light, doesn't it? If Mrs. Thornton had uncovered something damaging about the Ashford family, Gregory might indeed have had motive beyond a mere dispute about a lease. You don't think he killed her, do you?" Mrs. Clement looked worried. "He's always seemed such a harmless young man, weak perhaps, and a bit ineffectual, but not violent." "In my experience," Miss Marple said quietly, "the weak can become surprisingly violent when sufficiently cornered. But I'm not certain Gregory is our murderer. There are too many pieces that don't fit properly." "Like what?" "Like that scarf, and like the matter of timing. How did Gregory know Mrs. Thornton would be in that particular part of the garden at that particular time? And why strangle her when he could have confronted her anywhere, any time, if he truly wanted his documents back?" Miss Marple set down her cup with a decisive click. "No, there's something missing from this puzzle, some piece that would make all the others fall into place." "Perhaps," Mrs. Clement suggested, "you should speak to Annie, Mrs. Bantry's maid. She mentioned to our cook that she'd overheard something the day before the garden party. Something about Mrs. Thornton receiving a telephone call that upset her terribly." "Did she indeed?" Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "How very observant of Annie. I shall certainly speak to her." But before Miss Marple could pursue this lead, events took an unexpected turn. Word spread through the village that Gregory Ashford's motor car had been found, abandoned in a copse of trees about 3 miles from St. Mary Mead. There was blood on the driver's seat. Inspector Slack immediately declared it evidence of foul play. Gregory Ashford had been the victim, not the perpetrator of violence. The whole theory would need to be revised. Miss Marple, hearing this news from Dr. Haydock, who'd been called to examine the bloodstains, said only, "How very convenient." "Convenient?" The doctor looked at her sharply. "An injured or possibly dead man is hardly convenient, Miss Marple." "No, indeed," she agreed, "but convenient for someone who wants us to believe Gregory is a victim. Tell me, doctor, was there a great deal of blood? Enough to suggest a significant injury. Why?" Because, Miss Marple said gently, in my experience, when someone wishes to stage evidence of violence, they often overdo it. Too much blood from what should be a minor wound. Too many signs of struggle. The real question is whether this blood is even Gregory Ashford's. I assume the inspector will have it analysed. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You think someone is trying to make us believe Gregory is another victim? To throw us off the scent? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we should not assume anything until we have facts. But yes, it does occur to me that a murderer who has successfully made Gregory appear guilty might now wish to make him appear dead, thus preventing him from defending himself and closing the case neatly. But who would have that kind of calculated cunning? Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. That, Doctor, is what we need to discover, and I believe I may know where to start. Chapter 5. Hidden Motives that afternoon. Miss Marple paid a visit to Ashford Cottage, the scene of Mrs. Thornton's brief residency. Inspector Slack had released it from police custody that morning, having found nothing of obvious evidentiary value, and James Thornton had given her permission to examine his late sister-in-law's effects. If you think it might help catch her killer, Miss Marple, by all means, he'd said. The inspector seems content to believe his suspect is dead in a ditch somewhere, but I'm not convinced. Someone murdered Sylvia, and I want them brought to justice. The cottage was charming in the way of old English country dwellings. Low ceilings, small windows, and rooms that rambled without apparent logic. Mrs. Thornton had furnished it with taste, bringing touches of London sophistication to the rustic space. A writing desk stood by the window in what served as a sitting room, and it was here that Miss Marple began her search. The desk drawers revealed the usual detritus of daily life: bills, correspondence, a half-finished letter to a friend in London, describing the charms of village life with gentle irony. But in the bottom drawer, carefully filed in a leather portfolio, Miss Marple found Mrs. Thornton's historical research. The documents were meticulously organised, with notes in Mrs. Thornton's elegant hand annotating various findings. There were photocopies of records from the county archives, newspaper clippings from the 1840s, and a family tree of the Ashford line that Mrs. Thornton had painstakingly constructed. The story that emerged was indeed scandalous. The original Josiah Ashford had served with the East India Company and returned to England in 1843 with a fortune whose origins were murky at best. Contemporary newspaper accounts hinted at accusations of theft, specifically that Josiah had helped himself to a considerable cache of jewels and gold during the chaos of a local uprising. No charges had ever been brought, but the whispers had followed him back to England. More interesting still was a notation Mrs. Thornton had made in the margin of one document. Ask Mr. R.W. about great-grandfather's diary. Mentions J.A. specifically. Possible confirmation. Mr. R.W. Miss Marple tapped her finger thoughtfully against the page. Raymond West, the solicitor. His great-grandfather would have been contemporary with Josiah Ashford. This was worth investigating, but there was more. Tucked into the back of the portfolio was a photograph, clearly old but well preserved. It showed a Victorian-era group, several stern-faced gentlemen in formal dress, standing before what appeared to be a London club. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "The Ashford Affair. Those who knew." Among the faces was one that Miss Marple recognised from portraits she'd seen in the village. Josiah Ashford himself, looking prosperous and respectable. But there was another face that gave her pause, one that seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't immediately place it. She was studying this photograph when she heard footsteps on the path outside. Moving to the window, she saw Mrs. Bantry's maid, Annie, approaching the cottage with a basket over her arm. Miss Marple opened the door before the girl could knock. "Annie, what a surprise! What brings you here?" The maid started, nearly dropping her basket. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect, that is, Mrs. Bantry sent me to collect some of Mrs. Thornton's personal items for Mr. Thornton. Her jewellery and such. He's asked that everything be sent to London." "How thoughtful of Mrs. Bantry. Please, come in. I'm just examining some papers with Mr. Thornton's permission." Annie entered reluctantly, setting her basket down with hands that trembled slightly. The girl had been nervous since the murder, which was understandable, but Miss Marple detected something more than general anxiety in her manner. "Annie," Miss Marple said gently, seating herself and gesturing for the maid to do the same, "Mrs. Clement mentioned that you overheard something the day before the garden party. A telephone call that upset Mrs. Thornton?" The girl's face flushed. "I shouldn't have been listening, miss. It wasn't my place." "Of course not, dear. But sometimes we overhear things by accident, don't we? And in this case, what you heard might be quite important. A woman has been murdered after all." Annie twisted her hands in her apron. "I was bringing the post to the Colonel's study, miss. The door was ajar, and I heard him on the telephone. He was speaking to Mrs. Thornton, and he sounded, well, angry, miss. Not like himself at all." "Colonel Bantry was angry with Mrs. Thornton?" "Yes, miss. He was saying something about how she'd promised to be discreet, and now she was threatening to ruin everything. He said—" Annie's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said, 'If you go through with this, you'll destroy more lives than your own. Think of Dolly. Think of what this will do to her.'" Miss Marple's expression remained perfectly calm, but her mind was racing. "And how did Mrs. Thornton respond?" "And I couldn't hear her side properly, miss, but the Colonel said something like, 'Then you leave me no choice. I won't let you do this.' And then he rang off quite sharply. Did you tell the inspector about this?" Annie shook her head miserably. "I was afraid, miss. Afraid for the Colonel, and for Mrs. Bantry. They've been good to me. But also," she hesitated, "also, I saw something else, miss. That afternoon before the garden party, I was in the upper hallway, and I looked out the window. I saw Mr. Raymond West, the solicitor, coming out of the greenhouse. He looked around, like he didn't want to be seen, and then he went quickly to his motor car and drove away." "Mr. West was at Willowmere before the party?" "Yes, miss. But he wasn't a guest at the party itself. At least, I didn't see him there. And when I mentioned to Mrs. Bantry that I'd seen him, she looked surprised, said she hadn't invited him, and didn't know he'd been on the property." Miss Marple absorbed this information with her usual appearance of mild interest, but internally pieces were beginning to shift and align. "Tell me, Annie, when you were preparing for the garden party, did you notice anything unusual? Any items out of place? Or perhaps something that appeared that hadn't been there before?" Annie thought for a moment, then brightened. "Well, now that you mention it, miss, there was something odd. When I was arranging the chairs on the lawn that morning, I found a scarf caught on one of the garden chairs near the dahlia beds. A peacock blue scarf, very fine quality. I took it inside and showed it to Mrs. Bantry, thinking perhaps she'd lost it. But she said it wasn't hers. What did you do with it?" "I hung it in the cloakroom, miss, thinking whoever owned it might claim it during the party. But then, with the murder and all the confusion, I quite forgot about it. And is it still there?" I don't know, miss. I suppose it must be, unless someone took it." Miss Marple rose with decision. "Annie, you've been very helpful. Now, I think you should go about your task here, and I shall return to Willowmere. But please don't mention our conversation to anyone just yet. It's very important, yes, miss. But, Miss Marple, do you think the Colonel—" "I think," Miss Marple said firmly, "that we should not jump to conclusions about anyone. The truth is often more complicated than it first appears, and frequently quite different from what we expect." On the walk back to Willowmere, Miss Marple's mind was working furiously. The scarf had been at Willowmere House before the party. Left there deliberately, she was certain, which meant the murder had been planned, not a crime of passion. Someone had placed that scarf where it would be found and used as a weapon. But who? Colonel Bantry, who'd had that heated conversation with Mrs. Thornton. Raymond West, who'd been skulking around the property before the party. Or someone else entirely. Someone who moved through the village unseen and unremarked. At Willowmere, Miss Marple went directly to the cloakroom. The scarf was gone. She found Mrs. Bantry in the conservatory, deadheading roses with hands that moved mechanically, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Dolly, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "might I ask you something? That peacock blue scarf. Annie tells me she found it the morning of the party and hung it in the cloakroom. Did you see it there?" Mrs. Bantry looked up, her face drawn with strain. "The scarf that was used to— Yes, I saw it. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Assumed it belonged to one of the guests who'd called earlier in the week." "Do you know who took it from the cloakroom?" "No. I noticed it was gone after the police left, but with everything that had happened, it didn't seem significant." Mrs. Bantry's voice was thick with unshed tears. "Miss Marple, I need to ask you something. Do you think my husband killed Sylvia Thornton?" The question hung in the air between them. Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "I think your husband was fond of Mrs. Thornton, and I think that fondness put him in a difficult position. But murder? No, Dolly, I don't believe Colonel Bantry is a murderer. He was with her, you know, the day before she died. I saw them together in the lower garden by the summer house. They were arguing about something, and Arthur has been so strange since then, distant, preoccupied. When Sylvia was killed, I wondered—" She broke off, unable to continue. "You wondered if your husband might have done it to protect his reputation. Or yours," Miss Marple finished gently. "It's a natural fear given the circumstances. But Dolly, think about Arthur. Really think. Is he capable of planning a cold-blooded murder? Of strangling a woman with her own scarf?" Mrs. Bantry's face crumpled. No, he's not. Arthur can be foolish and vain, but he's not cruel. He's not a killer." "Then we must trust in that," Miss Marple said firmly. "And we must find out who is." She left Mrs. Bantry to her roses and made her way to the village high street. The solicitor's office was a neat Georgian building near the post office, and Mr. Raymond West kept regular hours. Miss Marple found him at his desk, surrounded by papers and legal tomes, looking harried. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with the automatic courtesy of a professional man. "How may I help you? I wonder if you might spare me a few moments, Mr. West. It concerns the late Mrs. Thornton and her historical research." West's expression became guarded. "I'm not sure how I can help you with that. She made a note in her papers about asking you, or someone with the initials A.I. Aberdew, about your great-grandfather's diary, specifically about entries concerning Josiah Ashford." The solicitor's face paled slightly. "Where did you see these notes?" "In Mrs. Thornton's papers at the cottage. She was researching the Ashford family history, as I'm sure you know." West sat down heavily. "Yes, she came to see me about 3 weeks ago, said she was writing a paper about the early history of St. Mary Mead, and wanted to know if my family had any documents or recollections about Josiah Ashford. I told her that my great-grandfather had indeed known Josiah. They'd been members of the same London club." "And the diary?" West hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "My great-grandfather kept detailed diaries. Most of them are mundane. records of weather, social calls, business transactions. But there is one entry, dated March 1844, that mentions Josiah Ashford by name. It's damning, Miss Marple. In what way? My great-grandfather wrote that Josiah had confessed to him, in a moment of drunken remorse, that his fortune was indeed stolen. He'd taken jewels belonging to an Indian Maharaja during the chaos of an uprising, then arranged for the Maharaja's murder to eliminate the one witness who could identify him. It's all there in black and white, a confession to theft and murder. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. And you showed this to Mrs. Thornton? I did. I shouldn't have, perhaps. But she seemed so earnest about her research, and I thought, well, it was all so long ago. What could it matter now? But it did matter. To someone. West met her eyes. To Gregory Ashford, you mean? Yes, I suppose discovering your ancestor was a thief and a murderer might be distressing. But surely not worth killing over. The man's been dead for nearly a century. Perhaps not to Gregory, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, but to someone else? Someone whose position in society or whose family honor depended on keeping such secrets buried. I don't follow. Neither do I entirely, Miss Marple admitted. But I shall. Tell me, Mr. West, were you at Willowmere House on the afternoon of the garden party, before the guests arrived? The solicitor's face flushed. How did you? Yes, I was there briefly. I'd received a note from Mrs. Thornton asking me to meet her in the greenhouse at 2 o'clock. She said she had a legal matter to discuss. And did you meet her? No, I waited for 20 minutes, but she never appeared. I assumed she'd been delayed and left. I had appointments in town that afternoon and couldn't wait longer. And you didn't attend the party itself? I wasn't invited. Besides, garden parties aren't my sort of thing. Miss Marple thanked him for his time and departed, her mind whirling. Mrs. Thornton had arranged to meet West at 2 o'clock, but hadn't appeared. Why? And who had sent that note, Mrs. Thornton herself, or someone impersonating her? The pieces were beginning to come together, but the picture they formed was still unclear. Miss Marple needed one more piece of information, and she knew exactly where to find it. Chapter 6. The Twisted Thread Miss. Marple's next destination was the post office, where Miss Pike, the postmistress, reigned over the communication hub of St. Mary Mead with the authority of a medieval castellan. If anyone in the village had sent or received unusual correspondence in recent days, Miss Pike would know about it. Good afternoon, Miss Pike. Miss Marple greeted her warmly. I wonder if I might trouble you for a bit of information. It concerns the late Mrs. Thornton. Miss Pike's sharp features softened into avid interest. Terrible business, Miss Marple, terrible. And that poor young Mr. Ashford, they're saying now he might be dead as well. What is the world coming to? Indeed. Tell me, did Mrs. Thornton receive much post? I'm asking on behalf of her brother-in-law, who's trying to settle her affairs. Oh, the usual amount, I'd say. Letters from London mostly, and her magazine subscriptions. Though now that you mention it, she did receive one rather odd item last week. Miss Pike leaned forward conspiratorially. It was a telegram marked urgent. Came through on Tuesday morning. Do you remember what it said? Well, I shouldn't really say. Postal confidentiality and all that. But given the circumstances, Miss Pike glanced around to ensure they were alone. It said, must speak with you before you proceed. Stakes higher than you know. J.T. That was all. J.T. James Thornton. I assumed so, being her brother-in-law, though he claims now that he knew nothing of her danger. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? It did indeed. Miss Marple thanked Miss Pike and continued her perambulation through the village, outwardly taking the air, but inwardly constructing and discarding theories with rapid precision. James Thornton had telegraphed his sister-in-law, warning her not to proceed with something, yet he'd claimed to know nothing of any danger. What had Mrs. Thornton been planning to do? Publish her research? Confront someone? And why would her brother-in-law care? Miss Marple's wanderings brought her to the churchyard, where the vicar was tending to the graves with his usual conscientious care. She found him by the Ashford family plot, a substantial collection of headstones marking 5 generations of the family's presence in St. Mary Mead. "Good afternoon, Vicar. A lovely day for such melancholy work." The Reverend Clement straightened, wiping his brow. "Miss Marple, yes, well, someone must keep the resting places tidy. I was just thinking about the Ashford family, such a prominent name in this village for so long, and now reduced to poor Gregory, who seems to have come to grief himself. The Ashfords have an interesting history, I understand." "Oh, yes, though not all of it commendable, I'm afraid. The founder of the local branch, Josiah, was a man of uncertain character, according to parish records. The rector at the time noted in his diary that Josiah's sudden wealth seemed to trouble his conscience. He made increasingly large donations to the church, as if trying to atone for something." "Did he succeed? In atoning, I mean?" The vicar smiled sadly. "Who can say? Only God knows what burdens a man carries, though I will say that Josiah's son, Edgar, seemed determined to live down his father's reputation. He was a model of rectitude, served as churchwarden, contributed to charitable works, married a bishop's daughter. Every subsequent generation has been at pains to maintain that respectability." How unfortunate, then, that Mrs. Thornton's research threatened to revive the old scandal. The vicar looked at her sharply. "You know about that? I've seen her papers. She'd uncovered evidence that Josiah Ashford was not merely suspect, but actually guilty of serious crimes in India." "Yes, she discussed it with me, asked whether I thought the sins of the father should be visited upon the descendants." The vicar paused, choosing his words carefully. "I told her that while truth was important, so was Christian charity. The living should not be made to suffer for the crimes of the long dead." "And what did she say to that?" "She said that unfortunately the living were already suffering, that keeping these secrets buried had consequences she was only beginning to understand. She wouldn't elaborate, but she seemed quite determined to publish her findings." Miss Marple thanked the vicar and made her way slowly back toward Willowmere, her mind arranging and rearranging the facts like pieces on a chessboard. Each conversation revealed new information, but somehow the complete picture remained elusive. She was passing the entrance to Ashford Cottage when she noticed something that made her pause. The gate was slightly ajar, though she was certain she'd closed it properly when she'd left earlier. Moving quietly, more quietly than one might expect from a lady of her years, Miss Marple approached the cottage. The front door was also ajar. Someone was inside. Miss Marple considered her options. The sensible course would be to fetch the constable, but the constable was likely at the police station, a good 15 minutes walk away, and whoever was in the cottage might be gone by then. Besides, Miss Marple had a shrewd suspicion about who the intruder might be. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sitting room was in disarray. Books pulled from shelves, cushions torn from chairs, the writing desk ransacked. Someone had been searching frantically for something. A sound from the bedroom sent Miss Marple moving swiftly toward the doorway. She arrived just in time to see a figure in dark clothes climbing out through the window. "Stop!" she called out with more authority than one might expect from a genteel village lady. The figure paused, half in and half out of the window, then turned. It was Gregory Ashford. Mr. Ashford, Miss Marple said calmly, as if encountering him in these circumstances was the most natural thing in the world. I think you'd better come back inside. We need to talk. For a moment she thought he might flee. His face was haggard, unshaven, with the look of a man who hadn't slept in days. But something in Miss Marple's manner, perhaps the complete absence of fear or accusation, made him hesitate. They think I killed her, he said hoarsely. They think I murdered Sylvia. Yes, I know. But you didn't, did you? He climbed back through the window and collapsed onto the bed, his face in his hands. No, God help me, no. But I might as well have. It's my fault she's dead. Perhaps you'd better explain, Miss Marple said gently, seating herself in the bedroom's single chair. Start at the beginning, Mr. Ashford, and tell me everything. And so he did. Chapter 7. Gregory's Tale. Gregory Ashford's story emerged in fits and starts, interrupted by emotion and exhaustion. But Miss Marple was patient. She'd questioned enough distraught people in her life to know when to press and when to simply wait. My uncle, great-uncle actually, died 18 months ago, Gregory began. I was his only living relative. He'd never married, lived alone in the cottage all his life. We weren't close. He was a difficult, secretive man. But when he fell ill, I visited him regularly toward the end. That was good of you. Not really. I wanted something. Gregory's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. I was in financial trouble, bad investments, gambling debts. I knew Uncle Thomas was wealthy, though he lived simply. I thought perhaps he might help me, or at least remember me generously in his will. And did he? He left me everything. The cottage, his modest investments, some family heirlooms. But it wasn't as much as I'd hoped. Most of his money had been spent over the years on something, though I couldn't determine what. The cottage needed repairs I couldn't afford, so I decided to lease it and live in cheaper lodgings myself. That's when Mrs. Thornton appeared. Yes, she responded to my advertisement, offered a generous rent, seemed the perfect solution. Gregory raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed. But then, about 2 months after she moved in, she asked to meet with me, said she'd found something in the cottage that belonged to me, papers that had been hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What sort of papers? Letters. Letters between my great-great-grandfather Josiah and someone called Thomas Blackwood. They dated from the 1840s, just after Josiah returned from India. Gregory's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They were terrible, Miss Marple. They detailed exactly how Josiah had stolen the jewels, how he'd arranged for the Maharaja to be killed, but worse than that, they revealed what he'd done with the jewels. What did he do with them? He didn't sell them, as everyone assumed. He couldn't. They were too distinctive, too easily traced. Instead, he had them hidden away, keeping only a few pieces at a time to sell through intermediaries over the years. The bulk of the treasure, worth a fortune even then, let alone now, was concealed somewhere, with clues to its location encoded in the letters. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with understanding, and Mrs. Thornton wanted to find it. Yes, she proposed we work together, use the letters to locate the treasure, and split it evenly. She'd done research into the historical background, understood the context of the clues. She said it was probably somewhere in or around the cottage itself. But you refused. Not at first. Gregory's face flushed with shame. God help me, I was tempted. The money would have solved all my problems. But then I really read those letters, understood what they meant. Josiah Ashford was a murderer and a thief. The jewels weren't his to take. They belonged to someone, to some family in India who'd been robbed and bereaved. I told Sylvia we should turn the letters over to authorities, let them handle it properly. And she disagreed. She was furious, said the crime was ancient history, that the original owners were long dead, that we deserved the treasure for finding it. She threatened to go public with the letters, to publish them in her historical research. She said she'd ruin the Ashford name unless I cooperated. Is that when you began trying to retrieve the letters from her? Gregory nodded miserably. I went to the cottage repeatedly, trying to reason with her, then trying to demand the letters back. They were my property after all, my uncle's property found in my cottage. But she refused, said she'd hidden them somewhere safe, that I'd never find them without her cooperation. And did you find them? No, that's what I was looking for just now. I thought with her dead, they might be somewhere in the cottage, but I've searched everywhere, and they're gone. He looked at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. That's why I ran away, Miss Marple. Not because I killed her, I swear I didn't, but because I knew how it would look. I'd been harassing her, threatening her. Everyone knew we were at odds, and I have no alibi for the time of her death. Where were you when Mrs. Thornton was killed? I'd followed her into the lower garden. I saw her leave the party and head toward the dahlia beds, and I thought... He broke off, swallowing hard. I thought perhaps I could reason with her one more time, away from the crowd. But when I got to the clearing, she was already there with someone else. I heard voices, angry voices. I stayed hidden in the shrubbery, trying to hear what they were saying. Did you see who this other person was? No. The shrubbery was too thick, and I was afraid to get closer. But I heard Sylvia say something like, "You can't stop me. I've made arrangements. If anything happens to me, the whole story comes out." And then the other person said... Gregory's voice dropped to a whisper. Then I have no choice. And then there was a sound of struggle. I should have rushed forward, should have tried to help. But I was paralyzed, Miss Marple, frozen with fear. By the time I finally moved, I heard footsteps running away through the garden, and when I reached the clearing... He couldn't continue. You found Mrs. Thornton dead, Miss Marple finished gently, and you ran. I panicked. I knew how it would. Look, me there, alone with her body, all our previous arguments known to everyone. So I ran back to the party, tried to blend in, then slipped away as soon as I could. I went home, threw some things in a bag, but then I couldn't decide where to go or what to do. I've been hiding in the woods since then, trying to work up courage to go to the police or to flee entirely. The blood in your motor car. I cut myself on barbed wire while I was hiding in the woods. Panicked and tried to drive away, got blood on the seat. Then I abandoned the car, thinking they'd find it and assume the worst. I thought maybe if they believed I was dead or seriously injured, they'd stop looking for me and I could try to prove my innocence some other way. He laughed bitterly. Stupid, I know. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, thinking. Gregory's story had the ring of truth. It was too pathetic, too self-incriminating to be a lie. A clever murderer would have concocted something more exculpatory. Mr. Ashford, you said you heard the other person's voice, but couldn't identify it. Was it a man or a woman? Gregory frowned, trying to remember. I'm not certain. The voice was low, muffled. It could have been either. And you heard no other details of their conversation? Nothing that might identify this person or their motive? Only that phrase about arrangements and the whole story coming out. Sylvia seemed to be holding something over them, some kind of leverage. He looked at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. Do you believe me, Miss Marple? Do you believe I didn't kill her? Yes, Mr. Ashford, I do. But I'm afraid that won't be enough. You need to go to Inspector Slack and tell him exactly what you've told me. He'll arrest me immediately. Possibly. But running only makes you look guilty. And meanwhile, the real murderer walks free, convinced they've gotten away with it. Idame, Miss Marple rose, her manner suddenly brisk. Come along. We'll go to the police station together. I'll vouch for your character, and we'll make sure the inspector listens to your story properly. Gregory seemed torn between hope and despair. You really think there's a chance, I think, said Miss Marple firmly, that the truth will out, as it always does. The murderer made one fatal mistake, you see. Something that seemed insignificant at the time, but which reveals everything once properly understood. What mistake? Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. The scarf, Mr. Ashford. It's always been about the scarf. Chapter 8. Threads Unravelling. Inspector Slack received Gregory Ashford's surrender with ill-concealed scepticism, though Miss Marple's presence seemed to give him pause. The young man's story was duly recorded, and while the inspector clearly remained convinced of Gregory's guilt, he agreed not to formally charge him until the evidence could be more thoroughly examined. Blood test will tell us if that's his blood in the motor car, Slack said, and we'll see if his story about hiding in the woods holds up. But mark my words, Miss Marple, this young man is guilty as sin. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, though I wonder if you've considered the matter of the scarf. Mrs. Thornton wasn't wearing it when she arrived at the party, yet it was found around her neck. Where did it come from? Obviously she had it with her in her handbag or pocket. I examined Mrs. Thornton's handbag after her death, Inspector. It contained only the usual items: a compact lipstick, a small amount of money, keys. No scarf. Then she was wearing it under her jacket. It was a warm day, Inspector, and Mrs. Thornton removed her jacket shortly after arriving. Several people saw her. There was no scarf around her neck. Inspector Slack's face reddened. Are you suggesting someone brought a scarf specifically to murder her with? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that the scarf was placed at Willowmere House before the party began. The maid found it on a garden chair that morning and hung it in the cloakroom. Someone took it from the cloakroom and used it to strangle Mrs. Thornton, which means the murder was premeditated by Ashford. Mr. Ashford wasn't at Willowmere House that morning. He arrived late to the party. How would he have known the scarf was there? This brought the inspector up short. He frowned, clearly trying to find a flaw in Miss Marple's logic. Maybe he brought the scarf himself. Then why leave it where a maid might find it and identify it later? No, Inspector, I think someone else brought that scarf to Willowmere. Someone who had access to the house and grounds before the party. Someone who planned Mrs. Thornton's murder quite carefully. After leaving the police station, Miss Marple made her way to the inn where James Thornton was staying. She found him in the public room, nursing a whiskey and looking thoroughly miserable. Mr. Thornton, might I have a word?" He looked up, seeming almost relieved to have company in his grief. "Miss Marple, of course. Please, join me." Miss Marple settled herself at his table and came directly to the point. "Mr. Thornton, you sent your sister-in-law a telegram last Tuesday, warning her not to proceed with something. What were you warning her about?" Thornton's face paled. "How did you— village grapevine, I suppose." He took a long swallow of his drink. "Sylvia telephoned me the week before. She was excited, almost manic. Said she'd made a discovery that would make us all wealthy, but that it might cause a scandal. She wanted my advice on how to handle it." "And what advice did you give her?" "I told her to be cautious. Sylvia was impulsive, always had been. She saw this as an adventure, a treasure hunt. But I'd been in business long enough to know that when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. I asked her to send me details, and when she did—" He shook his head. "I was appalled. Because of the Ashford family scandal? Partly. But more because of what she planned to do. She wanted to find this treasure, these jewels that Josiah Ashford stole, and keep them. She saw them as treasure trove, finders keepers. But legally, Miss Marple, they belonged to someone. Even if the original owners were dead, the jewels would need to be turned over to authorities. And the process of proving ownership, dealing with international law, managing the publicity, it would have been a nightmare. We'd have spent years in court and ended up with nothing but legal fees and damaged reputations." "So you telegraphed her to stop?" "Yes. I told her to abandon the whole scheme, to destroy the letters, to forget she'd ever found them. But she wouldn't listen. She said she'd spent months researching, that she'd solved the clues, that she knew where the jewels were hidden. She was going to retrieve them, she said, and if I wouldn't help her, she'd do it alone. Did she tell you where the jewels were hidden?" Thornton shook his head. "No, she wanted to surprise me, she said. Wanted to present me with fait accompli." His voice broke. "And now she's dead, and I can't help thinking, if I'd been more supportive, if I'd come down here sooner, if I'd tried harder to dissuade her—" "You couldn't have known what would happen," Miss Marple said kindly. "But, Mr. Thornton, I must ask you something. Did anyone else know about Sylvia's discovery? Did she mention showing the letters to anyone else? She mentioned a solicitor here in the village, West, I think his name was, said he'd been helpful with her research. And she said something about confronting the person who'd been trying to stop her. She wouldn't say who, but she seemed to think they were worried about the scandal more than the jewels." "Confronting them when?" "At the garden party. She said it was the perfect opportunity. Everyone would be there, and she could make her announcement publicly if necessary. She seemed to think that putting pressure on this person would force them to cooperate with her plan." Miss Marple felt a chill run down her spine. She was going to blackmail someone? I suppose you could call it that, though Sylvia wouldn't have seen it that way. She had a talent for justifying her own behavior. Thornton's face crumpled. "God, I should have done more. Should have come down here immediately, taken those damned letters away from her by force if necessary." Miss Marple patted his hand sympathetically, then excused herself. The pieces were coming together now, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than she'd anticipated. She found Dr. Haydock in his surgery, just finishing with his last patient of the day. He invited her into his consulting room with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Miss Marple, I assume this is about the murder?" "I'm afraid so, Doctor. I need to ask you about something medical. When you examined Mrs. Thornton's body, you said she'd been strangled with the scarf. Were there any other marks on her? Any signs of struggle?" Haydock frowned, thinking back. "Not particularly. Some minor bruising on her arms, consistent with someone grabbing her. But no defensive wounds on her hands, no signs that she fought back significantly." which suggests that the attack was swift and unexpected. She didn't have time to defend herself properly. The doctor paused. Or possibly that she knew her attacker and didn't realize she was in danger until it was too late. Exactly what I thought. Thank you, Doctor. Miss Marple's final call of the day was at Willowmere House, where she found both Colonel and Mrs. Bantry in the drawing room. They looked exhausted, the strain of the past days evident in their faces. Miss Marple, Colonel Bantry said heavily, I suppose you've come about my conversation with Sylvia the day before she died, the one Annie overheard. Among other things, yes. The Colonel exchanged a glance with his wife, who nodded encouragingly. I might as well tell you everything. Sylvia telephoned me that morning and said she needed to see me urgently. I met her in the lower garden that afternoon. She was in a strange mood, excited and defiant at once. What did she want? She told me about the letters about the Ashford treasure, said she'd worked out where it was hidden and planned to retrieve it. But she also said she'd discovered something else, something about my family. He took a shaky breath. My great-grandfather, you see, was Thomas Blackwood. Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. The man who corresponded with Josiah Ashford. Yes. Sylvia had found references in the letters suggesting that Thomas wasn't just Josiah's confidant. He was his accomplice. He'd helped Josiah plan the theft, had acted as his agent in selling some of the jewels. In return, Josiah had given him a portion of the proceeds, which Thomas used to establish his own fortune. So, your family's wealth was built on blood money, yes. Sylvia seemed to think this was all terribly exciting, like something out of a novel. She wanted to include it in her research paper, said it would make her reputation as a historian. She didn't seem to understand what it would do to me, to Dolly, to our standing in the community. Mrs. Bantry spoke for the first time. I told Arthur he should let her publish and be damned. We can't be held responsible for what our ancestors did a century ago. But Arthur was upset, thought it would ruin us socially. I wasn't thinking clearly, the Colonel admitted. I was angry, frightened. I told Sylvia she couldn't publish, that I'd take legal action if necessary. She just laughed and said there was nothing I could do. The letters were historical documents, and she had every right to use them in her research. Then she said something that really alarmed me. What was that? She said she knew I'd been visiting her regularly, that people would talk if she mentioned it publicly. She implied, she didn't say it directly, but the implication was clear, that if I tried to stop her publishing about my family, she'd suggest to everyone that we'd been having an affair. She'd ruin both our reputations. Arthur would never, Mrs. Bantry began hotly. I know, my dear, but you know how village gossip works. Once the seed is planted, the truth hardly matters. Colonel Bantry looked at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. So yes, I had a motive to kill Sylvia Thornton. I had opportunity. I was at my own house during the party. And I had means. That scarf was in our cloakroom, available to anyone who knew it was there. But I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. I swear on my honour I didn't. I know you didn't, Colonel, Miss Marple said gently. But I know who did. Chapter 9. The Trap. The silence that followed Miss Marple's declaration was profound. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry stared at her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You know who killed Sylvia? Mrs. Bantry whispered. I believe so, yes, though proving it will require a certain degree of, shall we say, theatrical management. Miss Marple's eyes had taken on a steely quality that her friends recognized. Beneath the genteel exterior, Jane Marple had the instincts of a hunter. I shall need your help, both of you, and Inspector Slack's cooperation. though I suspect that will be the most difficult part to arrange. In the event, Inspector Slack proved more amenable than expected. Perhaps because Miss Marple's previous successes had taught him to at least listen to her theories, no matter how outlandish they initially seemed. "You want me to do what?" he spluttered when she laid out her plan. "Arrange a small gathering here at Willowmere tomorrow afternoon. Just a few key people. Mr. Raymond West, Dr. Haydock, Mr. James Thornton, and myself. Tell them you've made a breakthrough in the case and want to go over some final details before making an arrest." "But I haven't made a breakthrough." "Not yet, perhaps, but you will." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Trust me, Inspector. By tomorrow evening, you'll have your murderer." The gathering assembled in the Bantry's drawing room the following afternoon had the air of a wake, sombre, awkward, with everyone clearly wishing they were elsewhere. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace with an air of official importance, while Sergeant Lake took notes in the corner. "Thank you all for coming," the inspector began. "I know this has been a difficult time for everyone, but I believe we're close to resolving this case. I've asked Miss Marple to share some observations that may help clarify matters." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who sat in her usual unassuming way in a corner chair, her knitting in her lap. "How kind of you, Inspector," she said mildly. "Well, I suppose I should begin with the scarf. That peacock blue scarf has puzzled me from the start, you see. Mrs. Thornton wasn't wearing it when she arrived at the party, yet it was used to kill her. Where did it come from?" "Someone brought it," Raymond West said impatiently. "Ashford, presumably. But Mr. Ashford wasn't here that morning when the maid found the scarf on a garden chair. Someone else left it there. Someone who had access to Willowmere before the party began." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Someone who planned the murder quite carefully and wanted to use an item that couldn't be traced back to them. "Are you suggesting the murderer brought the scarf specifically to kill Mrs. Thornton with?" Dr. Haydock asked. "Oh no, Doctor. I don't think the murderer brought it at all. I think Mrs. Thornton brought it herself." This caused a stir of confusion. "But you just said she wasn't wearing it," James Thornton protested. "She wasn't wearing it, but she did bring it with her, in her motor car, I believe." "You see, I've been thinking about Mrs. Thornton's character. She was a woman who enjoyed drama, who liked to make an impression. She'd planned to confront someone at the garden party, to apply pressure about her discovery. What better way to do that than with a visual prop?" "A visual prop?" The inspector frowned. "The scarf, Inspector. That particular shade of peacock blue is quite distinctive. I believe Mrs. Thornton chose it deliberately because of its colour. The same colour as the jewels Josiah Ashford stole. Peacock blue sapphires, to be precise. I found a reference to them in her research notes." Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached into her bag, producing the fragment of fabric she'd found caught on the rose thorn. "I also found this near the greenhouse, a piece of dark wool cloth, freshly torn. It came from a man's suit, I believe. Someone was moving through the garden in a hurry that afternoon, someone who didn't normally take that route." Raymond West had gone very pale. "Are you accusing me? I told you I was in the greenhouse waiting for Mrs. Thornton." "Yes, you did tell me that, and it was very clever of you to establish that alibi before anyone asked for one. But you see, Mr. West, Mrs. Thornton never arranged to meet you in the greenhouse at all. Someone else sent you that note using her name. Someone who wanted you out of the way during the crucial time. This is absurd, is it? Let me tell you what I think happened. Mrs. Thornton arrived at Willowmere that afternoon with the scarf in her motor car. Before joining the party, she took the scarf and placed it somewhere she could easily find it later, somewhere near the dahlia beds, where she'd arranged to meet her intended victim. But someone discovered it, perhaps Annie, doing her preparations, and took it to the cloakroom. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, conversational, but her words fell like stones into still water. Mrs. Thornton didn't realize her prop was missing until she went to retrieve it. That must have been terribly frustrating, but she proceeded, with her plan anyway, going to the meeting place at the appointed time. And there, someone was waiting for her. Someone who knew exactly where she would be and when. "Who?" Colonel Bantry demanded. "For God's sake, Miss Marple, if you know who killed Sylvia, tell us." "I'm getting to that, Colonel. You see, the murderer had taken the scarf from the cloakroom, perhaps intending just to hide it, to throw Mrs. Thornton off balance. But then the opportunity for murder presented itself. Mrs. Thornton was alone, unsuspecting. The scarf was at hand, and the murderer realized that Mrs. Thornton's death would solve so many problems." Miss Marple looked around the room, her eyes settling on each person in turn. The question was, whose problems? Who had the most to lose from Mrs. Thornton's discoveries? "My family's reputation was at stake," Colonel Bantry said quietly. "Yes, but you genuinely cared for Mrs. Thornton despite everything. You might have been angry with her, but you weren't ruthless enough for murder." Miss Marple turned to James Thornton. "You wanted to stop your sister-in-law's treasure hunt, but you could have done that legally, through courts and solicitors. Murder was too extreme." "Then who?" James Thornton began. "Someone whose entire livelihood depended on respectability and reputation. Someone who stood to lose everything if a century-old scandal came to light. Someone who'd built their life and career on the foundation of their family name." Miss Marple's gaze fixed on Raymond West. "Someone whose great-grandfather was Thomas Blackwood, Josiah Ashford's accomplice in theft and murder." The solicitor stood frozen, his face ashen. "You told me your great-grandfather kept diaries, Mr. West, that you showed them to Mrs. Thornton. But you didn't tell me that those diaries contained something far more damaging than just historical gossip. They contained instructions, didn't they? Instructions Thomas Blackwood had written to his own descendants, telling them where to find his share of the stolen jewels if they ever needed them." "That's ridiculous." West's voice was high, strained. "Is it? Your family's money ran out years ago, didn't it? The fortune Thomas built on blood money was spent by his descendants, leaving you with nothing but a modest solicitor's practice and a good name. But if Mrs. Thornton published her research, even that would be gone. You'd be known as the descendant of a thief and a murderer. Your clients would leave you. Your position in society would crumble. You can't prove any of this." "Actually," Miss Marple said calmly, "I can. You see, you made one crucial mistake. When you strangled Mrs. Thornton with that scarf, you tied a very particular knot, the same knot you use when you tie legal documents in your office. Sergeant Lake photographed the knot before the body was moved. Any expert can match it to your work. This was, in fact, a bluff. Miss Marple had no such photograph, but Raymond West didn't know that. She was going to ruin me. he burst out, his composure finally cracking. She didn't care what happened to me, to my practice, to my family name. She just wanted her moment of glory, her treasure hunt adventure. I begged her to reconsider, to at least keep my family's involvement private. But she laughed at me, said the historical record was more important than my feelings. "So you killed her," Inspector Slack said quietly, moving closer. "I didn't plan to. I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand. I sent that note to myself about meeting in the greenhouse, so I'd have an alibi for being on the grounds. Then I saw the scarf in the cloakroom, and on impulse, I took it. I thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe that I could use it somehow, as leverage." West's words came faster now, spilling out in a torrent. "I went to the dahlia beds and waited. When Sylvia came, I tried one more time to reason with her, but she just stood there, smiling that superior smile, telling me I was being melodramatic. She said nothing I could do would stop her publishing. She'd already made copies of all the documents, sent them to her colleagues in London. Even if I stole the originals, the story would come out. So you strangled her," Miss Marple said softly. "I didn't think. The scarf was in my hands, and she turned away from me, dismissive, and I just reacted. It was over in moments. And then I heard someone in the bushes, that fool Ashford, lurking and spying. I ran, circled back to the greenhouse, tore my suit on the roses in my panic. Then I drove away, as if I'd never been there at all." The silence that followed was profound. Raymond West stood trembling, his face in his hands, while Inspector Slack gestured to Sergeant Lake to take him into custody. "One thing I don't understand," James Thornton said quietly. "The blood in Gregory Ashford's motor car. You said he cut himself on barbed wire. Was that true?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said. "Poor Mr. Ashford told the truth about that. He panicked and ran, which was foolish but understandable. But he didn't kill anyone. And the jewels?" Colonel Bantry asked. "The treasure that started all this?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "I suspect they're still hidden somewhere, just as they've been for over a century. Mrs. Thornton may have solved the clues in the letters, but she never told anyone where they led. The secret died with her." "Perhaps that's for the best," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "Those jewels have caused enough suffering." As Raymond West was led away, still protesting and weeping, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. Inspector Slack approached her with something that might have been respect in his usually sceptical eyes. "Well, Miss Marple, you've done it again, though I still don't see how you knew it was West." "Oh, it was quite simple, Inspector." Several things pointed to him. The fragment of suit fabric suggested a man, which eliminated several suspects. The careful premeditation suggested someone intelligent and calculating. But most tellingly, he was the only person who had both motive and opportunity, and who was clever enough to create that false alibi about the greenhouse meeting. And the knot? Was that really identifiable? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Between you and me, Inspector, I'm not entirely certain. But Mr. West believed it was, which is what mattered. Guilt has a way of making people believe in their own detection." Chapter 10. Aftermath. 3 weeks later, Miss Marple sat in her garden in St. Mary Mead, enjoying the late summer sunshine and reflecting on the case. Raymond West had been formally charged with murder and was awaiting trial. Gregory Ashford had been cleared of all suspicion and was attempting to rebuild his life, though the trauma of the experience had left its mark. Mrs. Bantry visited that afternoon, bringing fresh scones and the latest village gossip. a welcome return to normalcy after the drama of murder. Gregory has decided to sell the cottage, Dolly reported, settling into a garden chair. Says he can't bear to live there or even keep it now. Too many terrible memories. Understandable? Miss Marple murmured. And the letters, the ones about Josiah Ashford and Thomas Blackwood, turned over to the authorities along with Raymond West's family diaries. They're being sent to the appropriate museum or historical society. The whole sordid story will eventually become public, I suppose, but at least it will be handled properly rather than sensationalized. And the jewels? Mrs. Bantry smiled. Still lost as far as anyone knows. The police searched both the cottage and the Willowmere grounds thoroughly, but found nothing. If Sylvia Thornton really knew where they were, she took that secret to her grave. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her eyes distant. You know, Dolly, I've been thinking about that. Mrs. Thornton was a careful researcher, methodical in her work. She wouldn't have risked everything on a treasure hunt without being certain of success. What are you saying? I'm saying I think she did find the jewels, or at least found where they were hidden, and was planning to retrieve them. But where? The police searched everywhere. Everywhere obvious, perhaps. But what if the hiding place was somewhere that would only be accessible at a certain time, under certain conditions? Miss Marple smiled at her friend's puzzled expression. Mrs. Thornton made a study of the Ashford family history. She would have known the layout of the cottage in Josiah Ashford's time, before later additions and renovations. And she would have known about the well. The well! The old well in the cottage garden. It was covered over years ago when the property was connected to the village water supply. Gregory's uncle had a garden shed built over the site, but in Josiah Ashford's day, that well would have been in active use. You think the jewels are at the bottom of the well? I think they might be hidden in the well shaft above the water line. A perfect hiding place. Inaccessible without removing the modern structure above it, and unlikely to be discovered by accident. Mrs. Thornton couldn't retrieve them herself. She would have needed help, which is perhaps why she was so insistent on cooperation, and why she made those mysterious arrangements that would reveal everything if something happened to her. Mrs. Bantry stared at her friend. Should we tell someone? The police? I've already had a quiet word with Inspector Slack. He'll handle it discreetly. If the jewels are there, they'll be turned over to the proper authorities and eventually returned to India, to the descendants of those who were robbed so long ago. It's the only honourable course. Justice at last, even after all these years. Yes. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with their usual steady rhythm. Human nature never really changes, you know. The capacity for greed, for violence, for self-justification. They're always there, lurking beneath the surface of respectability. Poor Raymond West convinced himself that protecting his reputation justified murder. Mrs. Thornton convinced herself that recovering stolen treasure was somehow heroic rather than simply another form of theft. And Gregory Ashford convinced himself that running away was somehow better than facing the truth. You sound rather cynical, Jane. Not cynical, dear. Realistic, but also hopeful in my way. Because alongside the greed and violence, there's also courage and honesty and the determination to see justice done. Gregory found the courage to come forward eventually. James Thornton had the honesty to admit his sister-in-law's flaws, and Colonel Bantry had the strength to confess his foolishness and trust in his wife's forgiveness. Mrs. Bantry reached over and squeezed Miss Marple's hand, and you had the wisdom to see through all the lies and misdirection to the truth. Oh, I don't know about wisdom, just observation, really. and perhaps a certain familiarity with the patterns of human behavior. Once you've seen enough of life, the same situations tend to recur, just with different players. Miss Marple smiled gently. This case reminded me of something that happened years ago in my village. A dispute over an inheritance that ended in tragedy. The details were different, but the essential pattern was the same. Greed, fear, and the terrible calculus that sometimes makes murder seem like a solution. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the bees work among the flowers. Finally, Mrs. Bantry stirred. "Well, I suppose life in St. Mary Mead will get back to normal now. No more murders and mysteries." "Until the next time," Miss Marple said mildly. "The next time." "Really, Jane, you make it sound inevitable. Well, isn't it? Wherever you have people, you have passions, love, hate, envy, greed. And where you have passions, you sometimes have crimes. St. Mary Mead is just a microcosm of the wider world. The same dramas play out here as anywhere else, just on a smaller stage." Mrs. Bantry shuddered slightly. "What a depressing thought." "I don't find it depressing at all. Rather comforting, actually. It means that understanding human nature in a small village gives one the tools to understand it anywhere. And it means that justice can be found even in the most unlikely places. In the observations of a nosy old lady with her knitting, for instance." Mrs. Bantry laughed, the first genuine laughter Miss Marple had heard from her friend in weeks. "You'll never be just a nosy old lady, Jane. You're far too sharp for that. Sharp enough to notice that you've eaten 3 scones to my 1. Dolly, dear, they're particularly good today. Mrs. Bantry's cook has outdone herself." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Miss Marple's garden, the two friends continued their tea, the conversation drifting from murder to more pleasant topics. The upcoming church fete, the vicar's wife's new hat, the latest romance between the young people of the village. But in her mind, Miss Marple was still turning over the pieces of the case, examining them one final time to ensure she'd missed nothing. The peacock blue scarf, now in police evidence. The fragment of fabric from Raymond West's suit. The letters and diaries that had revealed such old sins. And somewhere, perhaps still hidden, the jewels that had caused so much tragedy across generations. She thought about Sylvia Thornton, lying dead among the dahlias, her dreams of treasure and historical glory ended by a desperate man's hands. She thought about Raymond West, whose obsession with respectability had led him to the most disrespectable act imaginable. And she thought about poor Gregory Ashford, who'd wanted only to escape his family's past, but had found himself trapped by it instead. "Penny for your thoughts," Mrs. Bantry said. "I was thinking about that old saying, 'The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children.' It's a cruel truth, isn't it? Josiah Ashford's crimes, committed nearly a century ago, reached forward through time to destroy lives in the present. Raymond West killed because of what his great-grandfather did. Gregory Ashford suffered because of his great-great-grandfather's actions. And Sylvia Thornton died because she uncovered secrets that should have stayed buried. But surely the truth is always better than lies? In theory, yes. But sometimes the truth is like Pandora's box. Once opened, you can't control what emerges or who it harms." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked at her friend seriously. "That's why I'm glad those jewels, if they exist, will be handled properly, returned to their rightful owners or heirs. At least some good can come from all this tragedy. The stolen treasure restored, justice served, even if it's a century late. And Raymond West, do you feel any sympathy for him?" Miss Marple considered this. "Some, perhaps. He was placed in an impossible situation. Damned if Mrs. Thornton published, ruined if she didn't. But sympathy doesn't excuse murder. He made a choice, the wrong choice, and now he must face the consequences. That's justice too, in its way. The church bells chimed the hour, a melodious sound drifting across the village. Evening was approaching, bringing with it the promise of cooler temperatures and the soft sounds of an English summer night. "I should be getting back," Mrs. Bantry said, rising reluctantly. "Arthur will wonder where I've got to, though I must say, Jane, these afternoons with you are a tonic. After everything that's happened, it's good to sit here and pretend the world is simple again." "The world is never simple, dear, but it can be comprehensible if one pays attention." Miss Marple walked her friend to the garden gate. "Give my regards to the Colonel, and tell him not to be too hard on himself about Mrs. Thornton. We all make mistakes in judgment. The important thing is learning from them." After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting. The pattern was a complicated one, requiring concentration, but her hands moved with practiced ease while her mind wandered. She thought about the case one final time, satisfied that justice had been served, the guilty punished, the innocent vindicated, the truth revealed. It was as tidy an ending as one could hope for in an untidy world. And if somewhere beneath an old garden shed, a fortune in stolen jewels lay waiting to be discovered, well, that was a mystery for another day. For now, Miss Marple was content to sit in her garden, knitting and observing the small dramas of village life that continued around her. Because that was what she did best. Observe, understand, and occasionally, when necessary, ensure that justice prevailed. It was a modest talent, perhaps, but one that had served her well over the years, and would serve her well again, she suspected, when the next mystery came to disrupt the peace of St. Mary Mead, which it inevitably would. But that, as she would say if asked, was a story for another time.